Muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Mi nombre es Catalina Undurraga, directora ejecutiva del Instituto para la Resiliencia ante Desastres, y en nombre de todo el equipo les damos la cordial bienvenida a esta charla Itrend, relacionada con temáticas que estamos trabajando desde el Sistema Nacional de Prevención y Respuesta ante Desastres, integrada por distintos actores, ¿cierto? Y del cual Itrend es parte, donde estamos impulsando distintas temáticas relacionadas con cómo fortalecemos las capacidades de nuestro país para estar mejor preparados ante eventos extremos. Y hoy día tenemos una invitada muy especial que viene de hecho desde Londres. Antes de presentarla quisiera simplemente comentar que estamos transmitiendo vía streaming a través del canal de YouTube de Itrend Chile, si no me equivoco. Así que le damos también la bienvenida a quienes nos están acompañando a través de nuestras redes sociales en esta charla. Entonces hoy día en particular vamos a hablar sobre la resiliencia ante tsunami de las escuelas de Sri Lanka, un enfoque multidisciplinario. Voy a presentar entonces a la profesora Tiziana Rossetto. Ella es académica en Ingeniería Sísmica de University College London.
London, England,
es ingeniera estructural
and she's a structural engineer, and well has the degrees of a master's in engineering and sciences as well, also a PhD as well. She is a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering.
Es un honor tenerla con
And
nosotros
it's an
acá,
honor to have
y ha
her with
alcanzado
us.
el reconocimiento
And she has
global
been globally
a través de contribuciones
recognized by me for
fundamentales a
fundamental
la
contributions
caracterización
to the
del desempeño de
characterization of the
estructuras
structural
ante
performance
amenazas naturales desde
before
un
natural
enfoque
threats from a
multidisciplinario.
multidisciplinary approach.
A través
So, by
del
means
EPIC
of
Center
this
de
EPIC
UCL,
Center of a
que ella misma
UCL,
ha fundado,
who she
ella ha
founded
generado un
herself,
impacto muy
has
importante
generated a
en la
very important
industria,
impact
por
on the
ejemplo, a través de
industry, for
códigos
example, by means
sísmicos
of
y de tsunami,
seismic codes and
y en
tsunamis,
temas también de
and
regulación
also in
por parte
topics
de
from
gobiernos.
regulation from governments as well.
También ha
And
ganado
also,
varios
she
prestigiosos fondos,
has
premios,
obtained many prestigious funds and awards, among which we can highlight the ERC, European Research Council, and other awards which have been granted to her. In this lecture, then, Tiziana is going to focus on understanding the future impacts a tsunami may have in the school network of Sri Lanka from this resiliency approach. So, with this introduction, which I hope I covered all of Tiziana's experience, all her contributions from her knowledge and experience to this new knowledge, I'd like to give her the floor so she can give us this lecture. After her presentation, we are going to have a Q&A session where we hope you can write your questions, and we have actually some Itrend leaflets for that, so we can have an exchange. Please, Tiziana, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay. This one? Okay. Let's see. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. I wanted to thank Catalina and the Itrend team for the invitation. It is quite an honor to be here and to be able to talk about my work. I'm going to talk to you today about a project that I think embodies a little bit of what we try and do within Epicenter, the research center that I founded at UCL, where we try and combine different techniques to understand not only structural resilience, but actually community resilience also. So I hope that illustrates a little bit. The focus of the presentation is around schools and school systems. And I think we all know how important education is. It's one of the pillars of our lives. For those of us who have children, we knew how difficult it was to provide that education during COVID while we were at home. And without the support of schools, without the support of teachers, without the support of appropriate resources. So in a post-disaster environment, schools are extremely important, as they were during COVID, in helping us return back to normal life. And this is recognized by many international bodies, by the Sendai Framework, and by other strategies. So there are frameworks out there globally that are developed specifically for schools that try and look at schools not only as a structure, but as a system for providing education. And I think the GADRES in particular is an important guideline which promotes things like strengthening physical assets, which is sort of the realm of engineers, a culture of disaster preparedness, which is more in the field of disaster risk management and social science, but also cross-sector emergency management procedures, which don't fall in anybody's sector, really, and is something that we need to develop, I believe, as a community, generally. But these initiatives, which are, I would highly theoretical, there are some practical components of it, are not really brought into many national guidelines or national initiatives. And for me as an engineer, when I started to work in this field, I felt that to achieve resilience of an education service, we had to start looking at education differently. So we had to look at schools as part of an education service that, however, is dependent on other systems. And this education isn't only the schools, but has components of infrastructure that support it, like electricity, water systems that could also be affected by disasters. Of course, we have as part of the system the children, the teachers, but also the families at home. And so we can't take a simple disciplinary approach. And me as a structural engineer, I find that if I want to start to look at this quite complex system of education provision, I need to be working with other disciplines. So we put together a team, and we had a small project. It was a seed-funded project called Reschool, looking at the resilience of schools to extreme coastal flooding. And the initial budget was around £100,000. And we started this project about 4.5 years ago, and we're still going now. And basically, we have no funding. It started as 3 partners, and we have grown to this team, which includes universities from the UK, from Sri Lanka, from Italy, as well as a number of key stakeholders in country, in Sri Lanka, that have to do with the education system and with building resilience. So the aims of the project were to essentially identify weaknesses in the physical infrastructure and the disaster risk management of schools, to propose a framework for resilience interventions that might mitigate the impact of education disruption, in particular looking at the aftermath of a disaster. And we used Sri Lanka as essentially the focus for this work. Why Sri Lanka? Well, Sri Lanka was severely affected by the Indian Ocean tsunami, or the Boxing Day tsunami as it's called, in 2004, which devastated many of the countries around the Indian Ocean. 200,000 students were affected in Sri Lanka due to the tsunami. Sri Lanka is developed mainly along the coastline, and as you can see, many of the schools are actually lying along the coastline. These are dots of where the schools are located there. 182 schools were destroyed, but also 650 schools served as essentially shelters and locations for people to come together after the event. Interestingly, despite the devastation, the Sri Lankan education system was extremely resilient. So all pupils were back in education by January 2005. The 26th of December 2004 was when the tsunami hit. So it's a very short amount of time to restore education. And this is because the schools further inland essentially hosted students that were from the stated areas. But many years have passed since then, and we're interested to basically understand how has the resilience of schools changed, and how has the effect of the tsunami been considered in reconstruction. Essentially, it hasn't. schools have been essentially rebuilt in the same positions they were previously. This is partly due to difficulty in securing land. It's partly due to communities wanting to live by the coastline, because they are fishing communities, many of these, and because the major infrastructure lies along the coastline, so the major roads that connect the different cities. Interestingly, Sri Lanka also joined the UNESCO Intergovernmental Oceanic Commission and established a coast-wide tsunami early warning system. So this was one real advancement towards, let's say, resilience for tsunami. But we wanted to understand the situation from a multidisciplinary perspective. So the project had various components, and we're going to go through these a little bit. The first of these was looking at physical surveys of schools and understanding what their situation is today, so that we could develop numerical models to then look at risk in that way. So we conducted with our partners, and this was actually during the COVID period, so it's our local partners in Sri Lanka, conducted rapid visual surveys of 25 school compounds across the 3 areas that were hit mostly by the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, so in Batticaloa, Ampara and Gal region. The survey comprised overall about 50, just over 50 actual buildings, and we looked mainly at reinforced concrete structures. Apologies. What was the finding? The interesting thing about schools is they're built by the government in Sri Lanka, and they all follow pretty much the same type plan or similar type plans. So we found that most of the reinforced concrete buildings we could separate into 3 types of 3 building classes. 2-story and 3-story school structures that had very similar layouts. And the difference between the 2 3-story buildings that you see here is that this one has an extra bit of infill and an additional column that carries some of the loading on the end bays. But they're very similar in terms of layout. And this makes it extremely easy as an engineer to build a model of these 3 schools. And having built the model of these 3 schools and analyzed it, we can then actually generalize this to all the other similar buildings across the entire country. So why do schools get built according to a certain type plan? Because getting the authorization for building a school that has already been authorized, the plan has already been authorized by the government, is easy. So even in the reconstruction process after the tsunami, NGOs adopted the official type plans of Sri Lanka and didn't actually impose their own designs. So we have exactly the same buildings that were there before, rebuilt now. We have occurrence of reinforced concrete buildings and masonry buildings, which are the other type of structures that we found during our surveys. So most of the many of the other buildings within the school compound are 1-story unreinforced masonry buildings, and these are quite weak, and they've become less popular. So we've built numerical models of these structures, and we applied a new technique for testing them under tsunami loading. And this is a technique that we have developed at UCL, and that is now actually part of the ASCE 722 code in the US for tsunami assessment of structures. And what it comprises, I don't know how many of you have studied earthquake engineering, but in earthquake engineering we have something called a pushover analysis here, where you apply loads to the side of a structure and essentially push the structure over. Usually the load pattern is sort of an inverted triangle. In a tsunami, we converted this approach to a tsunami-type loading profile. So looking at essentially flooding, thinking about a triangle, this time the right way up, and starting from the base of the structure and rising, taking on and inundating more and more floors, essentially as the water level rises. This provides a different response to the structure than you would under an earthquake loading. And quite interestingly, a building under tsunami loading is more strong than under an earthquake loading. And that's something we're finding consistently. To allow our partners in Sri Lanka to analyze these buildings as well as us, we developed a toolkit. So we have now a very nice toolkit which can be used to build models, to develop what the tsunami loading on those models would be, to assess those, and then to interpret the results. And so we conducted a lot of capacity building with our local partners, who now are fully able to run these models, to run these assessments themselves. But going back a little bit to these school buildings, because these posed a bit of a challenge. They're quite simple structures, but they have particular features which are relevant in terms of tsunamis. And one of them is that they have these infill walls. Oops, sorry. They have these quite large infill walls, particularly in the short side. And because water is applied as a pressure on a surface, if the surface is large, the loads are large. So these infill walls actually have a very large influence on the strength of the structure or on the forces attracted by the structure until they fail. And this is a picture of when the wall fails. They can fail during the flow. So one of the things we needed to advance within our modeling was, how do we take this into account? How do we take into account the blowout of walls, essentially how the walls get damaged and blow out? And the other feature is significant openings, rather large slabs, which actually can take quite a bit of buoyancy force, or generate buoyancy force. So we developed an approach where we took into account the progressive failure of walls. So initially the water or the loading is applied externally. As the loads fail, the water infiltrates the structure. As the water rises, but the upper stories still have infill, you create buoyancy forces. So we're really taking into account the progression of vertical and horizontal loading. And this is quite innovative. And these are just some pictures of where we can take into account different configurations also of infill. Having done this, we analyze the structures, and if this runs, I'm not sure. Oh, it's running. You can see it's a very simple model. We have the water that rises, we have vertical forces acting, and you reach a peak, and then suddenly you get a failure of the structure. So nothing exciting, but it's just illustrating that we have a tool that sort of works, and we find that it does actually represent reality quite well. And we analyze different types of structures. So we analyze the typical structure that we saw, and this is an example of a two-story. And in the two different directions, this is essentially the height of inundation at which the structure failed. So if we take a Froude number of about 1, what we can see is that a typical structure will fail at an inundation depth of about, 4 meters for a reinforced concrete. And what we did was, there was a proposal at the time for strengthening schools. And what the proposal was to actually make those end walls more resistant. So to make them part of the structural system, to make them much more resistant. And so we analyzed this variation, and we found that actually by doing that, you lowered the capacity of the structure. Because you attracted so much more force, the walls were not failing anymore. Essentially, it's a bad design. So we have recommended against this, and it hasn't been taken on board by the Sri Lankan government. Thank goodness. So that's what a classical engineer would do. Go out there, collect the data, and develop a model and analyze it. And that's all great. And that gave us a partial picture. It gave us a picture for the engineered buildings. What it didn't give us understanding of was the non-engineered buildings. So those masonry structures, those weak structures, which are still part of the school compounds and are part of that process. And it also didn't give us much information on the recovery process, on how much money is required, how long does it take to rebuild these structures, etc. remember, the education system was restored only because pupils were able to go to other schools, more inland. So we were lucky enough to find a database of damage surveys for schools, for 154 schools, that was collected after the 2004 tsunami. And these damage surveys were in a pile of paper underneath the desk of the professor we're collaborating with, who he only found when he retired and cleaned out his office. So it was rather a luck, that this happened during the process. But we sort of jumped on that opportunity because it's quite a rare database. And we started first by digitizing the data. And this is just an example. So this is what those forms look like. They had quite detailed information about the arrangement of schools, which buildings had been damaged, and by how much. But to find out actually what they meant in terms of damage, the way they were saying, we didn't know what the surveyors thought when they were giving ratings of damage. So through this professor, we actually managed to track down some of the people who conducted the surveys to start with, which were his ex-alumni, his ex-students. And we interviewed them, and we understood how they were interpreting damage. So we were able to take this data, which is now, 17 years old, and actually understand how it was collected, which is one of the major issues with any survey data collected in the past. But we needed to look at current schools as well. So we tried to understand what has been the recovery process and where these schools have been. And so we complemented these surveys with Google Earth image analysis over time. We also integrated the data that we collected with other databases. There's another database that came out in 2009, which actually gave us the cost of reconstruction of these schools. But it didn't detail what was the damage. So we had the damage from the surveys, we had the cost of reconstruction from a different report, and we also had the status of reconstruction in 2009. One of the things that is interesting is, for those of you who know Sri Lanka, they would know that there was also internal civil conflict in the north and northeast part of the country, where the Tamil Tigers essentially had taken over areas. And it's quite distinct in this database that there is a very strong lag in reconstruction in these occupied areas. And actually reconstruction there only started after the end of the Civil War. So you can see the story about the recovery process coming into it. And we're trying to analyze this data more and more to understand different recovery pathways. So we're working also with social scientists in looking at this. Oops. From this database, we were able to come up with some damage data on masonry buildings, predominantly, which completed our sort of the tools, the fragility tools that we could use to look at these types of buildings. So they gave us predictions for masonry buildings. And if you can see here, the sort of inundation depths associated with failure are around 2 meters. So basically, you start to have problems with these masonry buildings after an inundation height of 2 meters. I'm just trying to remind you of these because we'll come to see them in a minute. What did we do with this information? We basically brought it together with inundation scenarios to see, well, how, if we take today's database of schools and we apply these tools for predicting the potential future damage under a tsunami scenario, what would it look like? And our tools might not be perfect, but essentially they're good enough for us to have a look at the distribution of damage along the coastline if you have a future tsunami. So we got this inundation data from the local geological survey, essentially, and we looked at and we assigned damage states to all of the different schools along here. Now this is an area of the Gull district, which is on the southern side of Sri Lanka. And what we can see is that for the inundation depths here, we are actually not getting too much damage. Most reinforced concrete buildings would not collapse. They might be at risk of some damage. Some masonry buildings would collapse along the area, but it wouldn't be total devastation. So in the case of a future tsunami in the Gold District, basically because of the replacement of masonry with reinforced concrete buildings, there wouldn't be a catastrophic loss of the education system. In the Ampara district instead, if there were to be a repeat of the 2004 tsunami, we see a very different story. We would now see the majority of reinforced concrete buildings as well as masonry buildings being damaged, and many of them collapsing. Already in the Ampara district there are less schools. It's a less populated area. It's a poorer area of Sri Lanka, and it faces directly towards Sumatra, towards the Sunda fault, which generated the inundation, the tsunami in 2004. And so here we're seeing a very different story. By developing these maps, what are we trying to do? We're trying to start a conversation, essentially, with stakeholders, starting to conversation with Ministry of Education, with local authorities, and with the NBRO, which is the National Building Research Organization, who deals with disasters in Sri Lanka, bringing them together and showing them a little bit about, what could happen and how might we plan for the situation. So what can we do in advance? So this engagement with stakeholders sort of happened throughout the project, right from the beginning all the way through, and we're still engaging with them because the project hasn't actually finished. But it's been very useful in starting to have these discourses, actually pictorially showing if there's a return of another tsunami, this is what might happen, what are you going to do about it? And talking also with the principals in the school. So the other area that we developed was a preparedness survey. So we used social science techniques, essentially, to create interviews and do semi-structured interviews with principals in schools. And we did this for, we did 25 interviews with school principals, but we also did 10 interviews with officials at zonal and national education, national and local educational officials. Our aim here was to basically understand a little bit about tsunami risk perception, now that we were 17 years from the last tsunami, to look at preparedness in the case of tsunami, and to highlight areas of difference between what the zonal and national education officials were saying and what the principals were actually implementing, understanding, or what they thought about preparedness. To highlight, Sri Lanka is far away from the source of any tsunami, so there is plenty of time really to evacuate. It hadn't been the case in the 2004 tsunami, which didn't happen at a time or day in which children were at school. So this idea of evacuating in the case of a tsunami sort of is not ingrained within their knowledge, or past knowledge. So, but some of the findings from these surveys with the principals were quite interesting. One, when compared to many other different hazards, the schools unanimously perceived that tsunami was one of the greatest life safety risks to their school. And they also found, heavy rains and flooding to be quite severe or potential for life risk, but much less so than tsunamis. They have this strong perception of risk from tsunami, which is interesting because, as I said, there hasn't been one for 17 years. Many of these people who are principals now were not principals then. Of course, they would have felt or seen the effects of the tsunami, but they wouldn't have been within a school context, or not in maybe as a student. So, and it's not only that they perceive the risk, but they also feel that tsunami is the hazard they're least prepared for. So it's these two factors together which are quite compelling. in terms of preparedness, we found that teachers, only in 7 of the 25 schools, had received any tsunami response training. That disaster preparedness training is not systematic at all. And actually, most schools have no drills or preparedness, even for common hazards like fire. So, we would have fire drills. They don't. They don't have fire alarms. They don't have fire extinguishers in their schools. So what we're trying to do here with some of our questions is compare this rather large and rare event with a more common hazard they would be dealing with every day. Schools experiencing a knowledge drain as well. People with knowledge of tsunamis or knowledge of that have been retiring or are no longer within the school system. They're no longer teachers. And surprisingly, only 1 out of the 25 schools had a disaster management plan. So they had an idea of what to do in the case of a tsunami. As mentioned, they don't hold evacuation drills, and 20 out of 25 schools have not participated in any training drill at all. The protocol for evacuation is really underdeveloped in this case. And so we inquired why, and who is responsible for evacuation, where is the information? They have no information about evacuation, and basically the responsibility for it and for the planning is left solely in the hands of the principals. And it's the principals who then, if they have the initiative, will instruct and will work with the teachers. So there's no, and because of that, there are also no consideration about what happens if you need to evacuate children who have lower mobility. So students who cannot evacuate by themselves, who are in wheelchairs, who cannot see, or have other, let's say, impairments. Some of the principals, when asked, where would you evacuate to, they indicated the upper floors of the buildings, of the school buildings. As we've seen from our previous, this is where our physical studies come back to inform, let's say, the evacuation policies. They can't, because even the reinforced concrete schools will have likely heavy damage, and many of them will collapse, particularly if in inundation areas of about 4 meters or above. So this is quite concerning, this lack of understanding in terms of what to do. And the other bit that was extremely concerning is the heavy reliance on the early warning system, an early warning tower warnings, basically, to initiate evacuation. So the schools would wait to hear the early warning sirens, basically, before they evacuate. So, but we did a little bit of a study, and only about half of the schools, if that, were within the reach of the audible distance of a tsunami early warning tower. So these schools, about half the schools that are in an inundation zone, so at risk, basically do not have an immediate access to early warning from the towers, and rely on secondary warnings, which may come from other messages, etc., and are definitely not developed. So bringing together the engineering, bringing together some of our insights, I guess, from learning about evacuation protocols or lack thereof, we're putting together some sort of recommendations that hit different areas and different features. From a physical perspective, we feel that we can do, or in Sri Lanka, there is the scope to do some limited, for example, strengthening. We find that those buildings that have the additional column actually perform quite a bit better than the ones that don't have that additional column. And that's the level of resource that they could deploy for a strengthening. Sri Lanka does not have the resources, and particularly governments and in terms of education, local education, would not inject much resource into this. So it's a big issue. And this replacement of masonry buildings with reinforced concrete buildings is quite important. one of the features that I didn't mention is actually while we were doing the surveys, we found an incredible amount of deterioration of the schools, of the new schools that had been built 17 years ago, post-tsunamis. And this is quite concerning. It's something that really needs to have action, and we're working with, we're trying to find the right way of communicating this essentially to the Ministry of Education, because they really do need to intervene to strengthen or replace those elements that are now so corroded that they are dangerous. So, and then we come to sort of other interventions, which might be more organizational. So we need to think about ways of enhancing warnings for school from the evacuation towers, or making sure that there is a secondary system in place by which they can obtain a warning in the case of a tsunami. We need to develop tsunami evacuation plans and drills that involve evacuating inland and to higher ground and not up to buildings, because the school buildings will not be appropriate for that. And indeed, we've already done some training in country with 30 school principals basically going through what an evacuation plan might look like for their school. And that's something that I feel quite proud of. You know, I didn't think that's something I would do as an engineer, and yet I feel very happy that we've been doing this. What worked very well in the past tsunami was having, you know, for the schools and the children affected near the coast to be able to be hosted by schools further inland. That was done a bit haphazardly at the time, but these links can be pre-arranged. You know, the bonds between coastal schools and their host schools further inland can be enhanced before the next disaster, and should be you know, that should be part of that education resilience plan. From an education perspective, what we found was that the teachers were not trained on evacuation. They were not trained to also teach curriculum content on hazard beyond just what was in sort of the content for geography. So they learn about earthquakes and tsunami in that way, but not in the context of their geography, their environment. But the teachers do get regular training, regular sort of professional development to update their knowledge on curriculum. So we are working with the Institute of Education at UCL to think about what could we implement to actually integrate within the teacher training courses on, for example, evacuation, or what to do in a disaster. How do you deal with students who are less able to evacuate and need more assistance? A very simple thing. We found from inquiry that many children in Sri Lanka didn't know how to swim. And as a survival tactic in the case of a tsunami, okay, it's maybe not the best, better to avoid the water, but, you know, swimming lessons can't hurt for a number of different, you know, water-related hazards. So making swimming lessons part of the school curriculum could actually help on several aspects, and is an easy win for everyone, and it's good for the children and their health. But also the communication, this aspect of there being communication not only with between the teachers and the children, but also between the schools and the families. So there was a warning which was not, you know, didn't translate into a tsunami. This happened in 2012. And anecdotally, what happened, it happened during school hours, and parents, instead of going inland, they went towards the school. So roads were blocked, you know, there was a congestion. Luckily, there was no tsunami that happened. But essentially, this idea of going to collect your children from the school before evacuating is something that needs to be avoided and needs to be discussed with families, so they know where is the place that they can go and find their children, because the schools will evacuate them to that, you know, meeting place. So this idea of there being an integrated disaster planning with the at home as well as in the school is quite an important thing. And so to have these sort of regular community and school level tsunami evacuation drills. We still have much to do. This is an ongoing project. As I said, it was sort of with a small amount of money but a lot of interest, and us, the partners, are still working together. We meet every Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock UK time, and we have a chat, and we take forward work, and we work on papers together, and we work on what are we going to do next. But there's still a lot to do. So translating some of these findings into policies, into practice, requires strong engagement with stakeholders, and much more than what we've done till now. So we need to, the next stage is we want to have a workshop with the stakeholders to discuss the school damage scenarios, to bring together not only disaster risk managers, but also the schools, the principals, to bring it as a multi-stakeholder workshop, so that we can bring in different perspectives, bring in the zonal education officials as well as the principals, because there is a disconnect between what the zonal officials think the school should be doing and what the school thinks it should be doing. That's quite clear in our data. We want to work with stakeholders to try and put into practice some of those mitigation strategies that we've talked about, so from the education side, the training side, but also from the structural strengthening. It has to be a multi-pronged approach. And we haven't yet done this, but it's something that, I know here in Chile is being extensively studied, is to bring into play also the effect of utilities in terms of the recovery of the school system. So if the utilities are not functioning, if there's no water, no electricity, even if the school building is standing, it can't be functional. It's not useful. You don't have the water sanitation that you need to run a school, so basically it would be closed. So we really need to think about these supporting networks, which in Sri Lanka are all along the coastline. They're all basically developed under the roads, so the pipeworks are under the roads, the gas lines, the electricity lines. So they are quite vulnerable to potential tsunamis in the future. So just to conclude, disasters and their root causes are highly complex, and we cannot just look at it as single disciplines. I think we only get a very small part of the picture if we look at it just from an engineering perspective. We also only get part of the picture if we look at it from a social science perspective. And I do think that we really need to bring together a lot of different disciplines in tackling this and coming up with a holistic strategy for improving resilience. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiziana, for your presentation. It has been very interesting to go through your slides and see problems that we actually have in our country. And from the Institute for the Resilience, when facing disasters, we have a lot of work when we need to make innovation, investigations, working with institutions to reduce the cost of the impact, but also to add value and to be able to take advantage of opportunities and to use new technologies, for example, based on those conditions that we have of being facing different threats. We've also looked with Itrend topics related with...
I have no translation now,
no.
right?
I sort of understand, being Italian, but not perfect. Thank you. I also feel very loud. Am I shouting? Is okay? Okay. Gracias. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
So I was mentioning before entering a Q&A, and from Itrend also, we've been working in a project connected with education, very similar to the topic that you've been able to study in Sri Lanka. It has to do with being more conscious of the territory and somehow not with any kind of information, but with materials that are prepared and based on scientific evidence. And this way, connecting all the results from the surveys and to be able to apply them to the school classes. So this is the project we have in Itrend. And also to let you know that everything that has to do with this project, that the disaster scenarios are part of the task and that were identified in the national strategy that has a mandate to improve the situation and to have available information and better information to be more prepared when facing disasters. So I'm gonna shut up now. I'm gonna open the space, the floor for Q&A, but I wanted to make this connection and maybe mention that this presentation from Tiziana today is fully connected with the purposes and the objective of Itrend and what we've been doing in different parts of the country. And now we have to align to be able to reinforce our system here. So now we're opening a space for Q&A. Does anyone have a comment or Q&A? Also, the chat from the YouTube channel is open. The question over here. Tengo una.
Sorry, just getting Spanish now. Please.
I have a question about the creation of the input for the analysis.
Mm-hmm.
How can you create the best use for the earthquake and tsunami? It's real data.
So we've done studies in the past where basically we have put time series for tsunami infrastructure. And what we find is because the tsunami, it's not a dynamic loading. Essentially, it is you get an initial increase, then you have a very static or stable applied load, which may increase slowly, and then it comes down again. So it's very much like a very extended, let's say, curve. And what does that mean? It means that actually we don't need to conduct time history analyses. We can conduct a pseudostatic, essentially, analysis on the structure and get a very, very good match with what we would get if we did run the time histories, and we've shown that. So I suppose the beauty about the tsunami analysis approach that we have developed, this sort of variable depth pushover, is that you don't have to know the details of the tsunami to do the analysis. You can just assess once for any tsunami height, because you're increasing the height until collapse. So it's a very nice approach, and it actually fits or predicts better the response than you would ever get in a pushover analysis for seismic, because seismic is a dynamic loading, so it's, pseudostatic assumption is not appropriate, but in the case of a tsunami, it is. And that's particularly important in the case of something like Sri Lanka, where you don't have recorded tsunami traces. Generally, you don't have recorded tsunami traces in the world. It's quite difficult because we don't have them, not on shore. We have maybe offshore. But beyond that, for those of you who know about numerical modeling of tsunami, you can know that modeling the inundation, so once the sea or the tsunami arrives at the shoreline and then travels up the shoreline and on land, that's very uncertain. In terms of the numerical modeling of that, it's quite difficult. And in particular, it's difficult to validate it because you don't have many observations, you don't have any velocity readings at all, there are none. So having reliability around what the trace could be is actually very difficult, even if you generate that numerically. So I suppose we use the fact that we can simplify the tsunami loading with something very simple, literally an increase in flow. It really does come to our advantage in a location that is data poor, like Sri Lanka is. So we had to create the database of schools. There wasn't one. But two, where there is this large uncertainty on what the tsunami loading might be and what it might be in the future as well. So In some ways, we're lucky that a tsunami has the characteristics it has. I'm not sure.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Professor Tiziana. Regarding the last slide that showed about the interventions.
Yes.
How do local stakeholders receive those suggestions? Did you have some problems, or maybe some skepticism?
So we're still working on that. The very important thing is that we are working extremely closely with our local partners, and they are esteemed people from 3 different universities in Sri Lanka. Peradeniya University, Moratuwa University, and Southeastern University. So they also cover different regions across the coastline. By having that very strong connection with them, they have also strong connections with professional bodies, with stakeholders, etc. And it's through them that we have to operate. I also conducted a rather large World Bank project looking at the regulatory capacity for buildings in Sri Lanka, involving multiple stakeholders, and so I already have a good connected network there, but we still have to work through our collaborators, and they are excellent partners. They're absolutely brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So it's a very rewarding collaboration, actually. You're welcome. Yeah. So, so the buoyancy happens. Let me just say the first floor when it happens. So you basically have the failure of the infills at the ground floor. The water rises. It inundates the structural elements, so already they become sort of lighter in some form. But air pockets form underneath between the depth of the beam and the slab. But then as the water rises outside, the infill panels on the second floor are still in place until they fail, but they will only fail after a certain height. So whilst there's a high water outside and not inside, you actually have a big air pocket there, and there the vertical forces are extremely large. And indeed, sometimes they will cause the blowout of the slab. Now, at the ground floor, you don't really have a slab in these schools. You basically have screed, so it blows out straight away. So we don't take into account that because essentially it poses very little resistance, so there's no point. Yeah.
You mentioned about knowledge drain and how it hinders preparedness.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
You mentioned knowledge drain.
Knowledge drain, yes.
How that hinders preparedness. So I just wanted to ask if you can reflect about the idea of perhaps institutional versus individual learning in this preparedness of disaster reduction process.
So after the Indian Ocean tsunami, there was quite a concerted effort to, at least in Sri Lanka, to do some training, to do drills, to prepare for the next tsunami. One, we have to realize the sort of death toll that happened in Sri Lanka. So actually many teachers died. So that's part of the brain drain. But then also many people moved away. So that's another issue. And other people who were, let's say, older in their career then retired now, 17 years later. But there just hasn't been that emphasis on tsunami since 2009. Really, since the finishing of the rebuilding of the schools, there really hasn't been any emphasis around tsunami. Other things have been happening in the country. And they've taken over, essentially. So there's no systematic training in this. But in other studies, what we find is very effective is if one training or one intervention can actually tackle multiple hazards or multiple things. And a drill or an evacuation would tackle fire, would tackle earthquake, would tackle any other reason for which you would have to, a gas leak or something that you'd have to evacuate a school building. So we feel that that's a really important part of something a teacher should learn because they are responsible for their kids in that moment. Yeah. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, we have a question from our from Juan Carlos Adoche. So he says, great project. What about new schools? Could you share some insights, suggestions about plan or vertical layout that architects should take into account?
Okay.
Also things hydrodynamics, or about structural design and construction that civil engineers should consider?
Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting one because Sri Lanka has a particular feature that it is far away from any tsunami source. So they do have the chance to evacuate. And tsunamis are so rare that really there's an argument, why would you design for them, right? So there isn't a strong case for designing a structure to be fully resilient to a tsunami. But one of the features that we have sort of been suggesting, and actually didn't come from us, came from the US, are things like having blowout slabs. So essentially, if you release the pressure, because the tsunami is a pressure, so if you let the infill walls fail, if you have slabs that essentially are sitting there, so under gravity loads are okay, but they have very weak connections in case of uplift, then essentially you're again releasing loads on the structure. So anything you can do to basically reduce the load on the structure would be a positive thing. The other aspect, and one of the major failure modes that I didn't cover here, was actually scouring of foundations, because all of these schools, or coastal schools, essentially founded on sand with very shallow foundations. And not a lot is being done around that aspect at the moment. And so that's an area that we're looking into more. We're conducting experiments now in the lab in the coming months or so. But initial ideas are, making sure that there are beams connecting the foundations. These cannot be very deep foundations. There's no finance to build, and piles, and it wouldn't just go into their culture to have piled foundations. So there's the problem between, wanting the school to be resilient and finances. And so I think there's that, in this case, we have to have that sort of balance of what damage, how can we design in damage, a little bit like we do in earthquakes, such that afterwards the restoration or the repair is easier, because it will be damaged, and there's no way that they can build in advance such that it won't be. So it's this concept that we've been talking about over the last few days with some of the people at PUC around resilience over resistance. We can't resist, but maybe we can build back and repair faster. So I think there's some clever concepts and thinking around that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have many questions, but the first one I have is about what is the real risk here? Is basically the integrity of the structure, or is the life of the students? Because you said this is a tsunami that occurs far away, so you have time for evacuation and things like that. So I need to know also about the profile of elevation along the coast of Sri Lanka.
So within the first kilometer or so of the coast of Sri Lanka, it's very flat, and then it becomes hilly. So we've mainly been out with the first kilometer or so from the coastline. So that's interesting. So the difficulty. So I think essentially school children's lives and the lives of those there are the priority. But having sorted that out, which you could do through organizational and training aspects, then we maybe have to think about how do we then think about restoring the education system after the tsunami. And that's where I think some clever designs can take place.
The tsunami is
rare.
It's been propagating, in the
Yes.
Indian Ocean for, I don't know, maybe minutes.
Yes.
Is a problem, I mean, actually, the life? I mean, if you have an early warning system, then we'll have enough time just to go and evacuate?
So the question,
not?
yes, we'll have the time to evacuate, yes. And it's not a couple of minutes, it's more half an hour to, no, it's substantial. It's not an immediacy. The question is they need to get the warning, they need to trust the warning, and that's something that Loughborough University have been looking a lot at. You know, it's like, how many false tsunami warnings are there? And so, you know, should they trust and should they evacuate? We don't trust the fire drills that happen all the time, the fire alarms. We sit around and say, oh, let's wait what other people do and see whether we should evacuate or not, right? You don't want to be doing that in the case of tsunami. All that time is wasted. But they would have plenty of time to evacuate if the decision to evacuate were made. It's very interesting. We'd actually looked at hospitals in Sri Lanka as well, in a parallel project. And when we talked to hospitals that were clearly in the inundation zone, and we spoke to them about evacuation, they go, sure, we'll take more patients in the case of a disaster. And we're like, no, but you have to evacuate your patients. They were like, are you crazy? They're in beds, they're not mobile, we can't evacuate these people. So schools are maybe easier to sort out than hospitals. I think hospitals is really where things become difficult, because you're talking about people on, you know, respirators and on other sort of life-critical support systems. So,
what's the improvement on the once you do
yes.
your retrofit on the structures?
Yeah.
I mean, basically you're kind of redoing the same situation as before the tsunami in 2004, or you're doing something else that really improved the resilience of these structures. I need to understand what happened. I mean, because you're kind of, I mean,
we're slightly stuck at this. I think we're slightly stuck at this point because it's a matter of resource, and it's a matter of acceptance that this is an issue and that it may happen again. And so that's when we struggle with such a rare event, I think, in putting forward things, because it's not their priority to add an extra column, which might give it, you know, another meter or so inundation resilience. It might not be their priority to, well, it isn't their priority, for example, at the moment, to repair even the very corroded elements that are there, and that are actually not, you know, not good for the stability under even gravity loads of the structures, or some structures. And these are structures that were rebuilt 17 years ago. So, yeah. So I don't know if I've answered your question. It is a dilemma.
Thank you, Tiziana, for your
Yes.
presentation. Well, a disclaimer, I work with the school, so sorry if this question is so specific.
It's wonderful.
You talked at the beginning that there is a disconnection between the National Preparedness Plan and the principles implementation of these plans. And I wonder if you have explored the bottom layer of this, because sometimes the family's expectations or trust on these schools' plans are not such trustful.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have explored by some surveys among the children and the families in case they are willing to follow these plans.
Not yet. I think the answer is that not yet. We haven't yet done that. We are exploring more the let's say the resilience of children and family perspective, and the relationship between family and children in Indonesia, where we have another project on schools, which is being led by a colleague of mine who's in psychology. And when you talking to children, and you know, it's very difficult, and you don't want to re-traumatize. In the case of Indonesia, it's survivors from the Palu tsunami that happened in 2018. So it's a very delicate process, and how you engage with home. So it's something that's still underway on that project, but we haven't done in Sri Lanka yet. It's something we may want to do. Let's see how it goes in the other area. But you're quite right. I mean, the issue of trust is important, I don't know that you can drill, as many drills as you like. I don't know whether you can drill that out of people and whether they will still go for their child afterwards because they don't trust maybe the school system or something to evacuate. I don't know.
Thank you. And the last question is, after pandemic,
yes,
2 years of pandemic in which education and the life with the children was basically at home, how have you engaged with the community by communicating what happened with the school after an evacuation?
Do you mean how do we learn from COVID? Or
no, as this is an ongoing project.
Yes.
Did you engage with the community before COVID? Or
no, not yet. No.
Oh, okay.
So basically, the school surveys and then the interviews with principals, we had to do remotely. Like the interviews with principals were done by local people, local agents, basically who specialize in this within Sri Lanka. So we designed the questionnaire, we designed the interview, but they conducted it. We were not able to travel there due to COVID reasons, etc. And it was a very delicate process of actually approaching even the school principals, etc. It was a bit difficult, but it was done. It's maybe not the ideal situation, but yes, if we can, it would be wonderful to be able to actually work with the community to expand the study to that sort of level. But yeah, it's still ongoing. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tiziana. You showed something about the functionality analysis. Could you please give some details about how did you define a functionality metric? Was it based from spaces? I saw classrooms and something like that. And sorry.
Really? Okay.
Or you showed before that, no? You showed something about functionality.
Okay. This I know the one. This one.
There, yeah. And the first question is, how did you define the functionality metric, and if it is linked to physical spaces, like a certain type of spaces? And the second one is, how do you link this to the damage?
Okay, so this is actually the representation of the damage surveys. So this is data that comes directly from the damage surveys from the paper versions of the school. So these were surveyors who went out after the event, and they basically wrote down what they saw. And they we're very lucky. This is quite a unique data set because it actually brings together all of the details of the school, which is quite nice. So we have the layout of every building, all sketched out. We have the material of every building. We know how many floors they are. We know what they were used for at the time, and we know the state of damage. And the state of damage is described in terms of the walls, in terms of the windows and doors, in terms of the roof. So it's quite detailed. And then there are sketches and quite some nice information on the side. So in terms of many years of working on empirical fragility, this is one of the best data sets that we have in terms of actually having the original data. There was some confusion around interpreting the damage because they were using a scale of 1 to 10, and many times it was 1 or 10, and we didn't quite understand what it meant, and nor how they interpreted damage to windows and doors versus walls. So we were very lucky to be able to find 3 surveyors who were original surveyors, which we got because they put their name on the forms. So we were able to track them down because they were alumni of our colleagues in Sri Lanka. And they were kind enough to talk to us and to tell us how they were interpreting the damage and how we could therefore interpret the damage from their damage surveys paper. So it's been quite an interesting one. And so we were able to, this is just showing the damage essentially by I suppose, category of type of building. So, most of the school structures hold classrooms effectively, but you can see here that the red, almost half of the classrooms essentially were collapsed or were lost in the case of the tsunami. This is across the 154 buildings, 154 schools, and each school is a compound of a number of buildings. So we're looking at a large number of buildings. I don't know exactly the number, but at least 10 times the number of schools. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a last question coming from our YouTube channel. From Cristóbal Mena. So, Tiziana, have you assessed the behavioral biases and cultural background to ensure prompt evacuation? If so, what were the findings? And then the final one, how can we link vernacular construction with tsunami resilience?
You can't. I think that's just going to go. No, I lie, actually. So I think the latter one is easier to answer. So what we saw in Sri Lanka is their vernacular construction is either what we call sort of timber, one-story type housing, or a masonry one-story house with wood roof or similar, or wood truss with tin covering roof. Those sort of structures would essentially, any inundation of 2 meters would demolish those. So they're not good. However, in other countries, particularly in Indonesia, we've seen that some vernacular construction is actually quite good, and that's the ones that are on stilts. So for small inundations, they're actually quite resilient. They allow the water to pass underneath, and surprisingly, even rickety ones were standing really well in the Palu area after the 2018 tsunami. So I think that is quite interesting. At the same time, what is their earthquake resilience? I'm not so sure. So you put a building on stilts. It's good for one hazard, maybe not so much for another. So yeah, there's some discourse there. The other question was the cultural biases in terms of evacuation. We haven't looked into them, but I don't think there are. I don't think there's any particular bias against evacuating a structure in any way. I think it is a very hierarchical society. So, the school children will listen to the teachers and the teachers listen to the heads. It's very hierarchical. So actually in terms of, I suppose, preparedness or listening to instructions, that's maybe a good thing. But we haven't explored it explicitly. Yeah.
No sé si hay alguna otra pregunta, pero creo que está... una última y luego ya en honor al tiempo vamos cerrando, pero aprovechamos que estamos aquí.
Let's take advantage that we have people here.
Thank you, Tiziana, for your presentation. Just one last question. Your presentation didn't cover waterborne debris loads.
Yep.
And we know that sometimes they can be way larger than aerodynamic loads. So my question is, if you
why? Yeah.
Why? And if
we don't know
you
enough
will
about
address
them
it in the future.
Okay, so tsunami engineering is quite new as from a structural engineering perspective, and until fairly recently there were very basic codes about it. So debris loads are included within the codes of practice, but they assume it's a log, and the log hits you and you can tell the velocity and you know where it's hitting. Or on the other hand, if you're near a port, they assume it's a container, and that's quite a different type of loading. But those are also the two categories for which experiments have actually been carried out to try and look at and characterize the loads from floating debris. So there's not that much, I'd say, experimental data or work on debris. And we know that they can take different forms. You know, the debris could be a car, a boat, or a piece of wood. It could be, everything in between. So from that perspective, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with debris. The one things where we have taken it into account is our rapid surveys, our rapid visual surveys. We do, in the case of earthquakes, when you're looking at a building, you're just looking at the building. But in the case of tsunamis, we actually look at the environment around as well. So we do look at anything that could become debris. So, you know, is there a parking lot nearby where you could have cars lifted and hitting? But also, are there defenses? Like, is there a wall surrounding the school, a compound wall that quite commonly there is? Is there sheltering? Is the building you're looking at behind a really massive building that's more coastally towards you and is sheltering you? So it's a slightly different way of looking at the buildings where you're not just looking at the one building but around. The only way we take into account debris really is by assuming that it dams up the openings. So for example, in ASC 7, we can make the assumption that 70% of the openings are dammed up, closed by debris after a certain time. But it's very uncertain. So in this case, we haven't taken it into account. But you're quite right, we're probably underestimating the damage. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bueno, voy a pasar al español.
Okay.
Para ir cerrando, agradecer obviamente a Tiziana por esta charla, por esta conversación tan interesante, agradecer también a quienes estuvieron presentes acá, quienes nos acompañaron a través del canal de YouTube y por cierto también a la Corfo, a las instituciones que hacen posible que Itrend exista y que podamos seguir promoviendo este tipo de instancias, al Ministerio del Interior y Seguridad Pública, a todos los socios de la corporación Itrend y por supuesto al equipo de Itrend, el más importante que está detrás de todo esto. Así que muchas gracias nuevamente y nos estamos viendo muy pronto con una próxima charla Itrend. Buenas tardes.